At 75 years old, Chris Norman finally decided to say what he had kept to himself for decades. Not in a headline, not in a scandal, but in a calm, reflective moment shaped by time, memory, and truth. For years, fans speculated what really happened behind the scenes of one of rock music's most unforgettable collaborations. What did Chris Norman truly think about the woman who stood beside him at a pivotal moment in his life and career? Now, with nothing left to prove and no image left to protect, Chris Norman speaks openly, honestly, and without filters about Suzi Quatro. This is not a story about gossip. It is not about rivalry or rumors. It is about legacy, about respect, and about finally setting the record straight before the fame, before the sold-out arenas, before the pressure of the music industry reshaped everything. There was a young boy growing up in northern England, surrounded by music long before he understood its power, and that is where this story truly begins. Long before the spotlight ever found him, Chris Norman was already living inside music. He was born Christopher Ward Norman on October 25th, 1950, in the coastal town of Redcar, North Yorkshire, England. Music was not something he discovered later in life. It was there from the very beginning. His father was a professional singer and entertainer, and in the Norman household, melodies were as common as conversation. When the family later moved to Bradford, young Chris grew up during a time when Britain itself was changing. Post-war youth culture was exploding. Rock and roll, skiffle, and early pop were no longer just sounds on the radio. They were shaping identity, rebellion, and dreams. And Chris absorbed all of it. As a teenager, he picked up a guitar and began performing with school friends. At first, there was nothing glamorous about it. Small rooms, simple chords, long hours of practice. But even then, something stood out. His voice. It wasn't polished. It wasn't theatrical. It was husky, emotional, and unmistakably human. While many singers chased perfection, Chris Norman's voice carried vulnerability. There was grain in it, feeling. A rawness that made people listen more closely. Even in those early years, it separated him from others, trying to sound bigger or smoother than they really were. In the mid-1960s, he formed a band with friends, Alan Silson, Terry Utley, Ron Kelly, and later Pete Spencer. Like countless young bands, they struggled. They changed names. They played wherever they could. Progress was slow, often discouraging. But those years mattered. They shaped discipline. They built chemistry. They taught resilience. Eventually, the group became known as Smokie, and that change marked a turning point that would alter all of their lives forever. What followed was not overnight success, but something more powerful, momentum. And soon, the right people would hear that voice, the one that refused to be ignored. When a Smokie finally caught the right wave, it wasn't luck. It was timing, persistence, and a crucial factor that made them impossible to mistake for anyone else: Chris Norman's voice. In the mid-1970s, the band began working with the powerhouse songwriting and production duo Nicky Chin and Mike Chapman. And once that partnership clicked, everything changed fast. It was like someone opened a door that had been locked for years, and a Smokie walked through it with fire behind them. What followed was a surge of international hits that didn't just chart, they stuck. Songs like Living Next Door to Alice, If You Think You Know How to Love Me, Don't Play Your Rock and Roll to Me, I'll Meet You at Midnight, and Lay Back in the Arms of Someone became more than tracks on an album. They became anthems, familiar, emotional, played in cars, pubs, living rooms, and late-night radio stations across the world. But here's what made them last. Those songs weren't just catchy. They felt real, and that came from the way Chris Norman sang them. His delivery held a strange balance, vulnerable but strong, tender but never weak, like a man confessing something he didn't want to admit, but couldn't keep inside anymore. That emotional honesty gave Smokie's music depth, and it made listeners feel like the band understood them. Smokie became especially huge in continental Europe, Australia, and the UK. Millions of fans, tens of millions of records sold worldwide. Night after night, crowds showed up not just to hear the hits, but to feel them. During that era, Chris Norman wasn't simply the singer. He became the face of sincerity in a music industry that often felt manufactured. People believed him. And that belief mattered because as the years piled up, tours, recordings, pressure, expectations, something began to tighten around the band. Behind the success, there was another truth growing quietly. Smokie was famous, but creatively, the walls were closing in. By the early 1980s, after years of relentless touring and industry demands, the members of Smokie began to feel constrained. The machine of success that had lifted them up was now telling them what to be, how to sound, and where to go next. And Chris Norman, more than anyone, felt it. He didn't just want to perform, he wanted freedom. He wanted a voice that belonged to him, not the system around him. And that hunger would lead to a decision so risky it could have destroyed everything he built. But instead, it would transform his life. Leaving a successful band is the kind of decision that ruins careers. Most artists never recover. The public moves on, the hits stop coming, and the story ends with a quiet fade into nostalgia. But Chris Norman didn't leave Smokie because he was chasing fame. He left because he was chasing himself. By 1986, after years of pressure and feeling creatively boxed in, he made the choice that terrified even the people closest to him. He stepped away from the band that made him a global name and began the uncertain road of a solo career. It was risky, it was bold, and it was the moment where everything could have collapsed. But instead, it became the moment where everything opened. Almost immediately, his leap into solo work proved transformative. And one song, in particular, would become the turning point that rewrote his future, a duet. In 1986, Chris Norman released Stumblin In with Suzi Quatro, and the impact was massive. The song became a huge international hit, topping charts and introducing Chris Norman to an entirely new generation of listeners. And what made it unforgettable wasn't just the melody, it was the intimacy. In that duet, listeners heard a softer, more tender side of his voice. The huskiness was still there, but now it carried warmth, vulnerability, a kind of emotional nuance that felt almost like confession. It wasn't the stadium frontman anymore. It was a man singing with his guard down. That success didn't stop at one song. Chris Norman followed it with solo albums that cemented his reputation as a mature, emotionally driven artist. Tracks like Midnight Lady, Some Hearts Are Diamonds, and No Arms Can Ever Hold You didn't just perform well, they became deeply beloved, especially in places where audiences connected strongly to emotional storytelling in music. Germany, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe. In those regions, Chris Norman didn't feel like a former band member, he felt legendary. And what's remarkable is that, unlike so many artists who crumble after leaving a famous group, Chris Norman didn't just survive, he thrived, because he stayed true to what his instincts kept screaming for: authenticity. His solo work blended pop, soft rock, and subtle country influences. The themes became more introspective: love, longing, reflection, resilience. You could hear maturity in the lyrics and life experience in the way he carried each line. And that's why this story matters, because when Chris Norman speaks about Suzi Quatro today, it isn't as a man chasing headlines. It's as someone who knows she was part of a pivotal chapter, not only in his career, but in the way the world heard him. And yet, even after that success, Chris Norman's journey didn't slow down. If anything, he became something rarer, an artist who refuses to disappear. Most voices don't survive time. They get replaced by trends, they get softened by age, they get buried beneath yesterday's hits. But Chris Norman's voice did something different. It aged like weathered wood, rougher, deeper, richer with character. And instead of running from time, he let time shape him. Decades after Smokie's peak and long after many of his peers stepped away, he continued doing what true artists do best. He kept showing up. He continued to tour extensively, release new albums, and perform to sold-out audiences across Europe and beyond. And what made those concerts powerful wasn't nostalgia alone. It was the raw emotion still living inside his vocals. The same honesty people heard in the 1970s, now carried by experience. Chris Norman never relied solely on the past. Yes, he honored Smokie's legacy, but he didn't live inside it. He kept creating new music, balancing respect for what came before with the courage to keep evolving. That's rare. Most artists either abandon their history or become trapped in it. Chris Norman managed something almost impossible. He stayed real. His international appeal was publicly affirmed in 1994 when he received one of the most prestigious accolades of his solo career, CMT Europe's International Video Star of the Year. At a time when music television played a decisive role in shaping a stardom across borders, that recognition proved his solo identity was not a side story. It stood on its own. And then, in 2004, he reminded the public once again that he was never truly gone. He took part in a comeback show on the German television network ProSieben, a program designed to reunite and celebrate legendary artists. And one of the most talked about moments came when he performed Stumblin In again, this time as a duet with pop icon Suzi Quatro. It wasn't just a performance, it was a reminder that a song can outlive decades, and that a voice like his doesn't disappear. It simply returns when the world is ready to feel it again. But the emotional peak of that series came in the final episode when Chris Norman joined Smokie on a stage for the closing song. And for fans who had lived through the band's golden era, it didn't feel like a TV segment. It felt like a shared history breathing again. Then in 2019, his status as a beloved international performer was reinforced in a setting filled with symbolism and prestige. He headlined the White Nights Music Festival in St. Petersburg. This wasn't a random booking. The event was organized as a tribute to the extraordinary 50-year career of Russian cultural icon Alla Pugacheva. Being chosen as a headliner for such a milestone celebration was a quiet statement of how much respect Chris Norman commands far beyond the UK. Sharing that stage with artists like Level 42, Bonnie Tyler, and Svetlana Loboda, he delivered a performance that blended decades of experience with undiminished passion. Under the luminous white night sky, he proved something simple but powerful. A real legacy is not measured by trends. It's measured by the ability to move people year after year, generation after generation. And now at 75, standing at the edge of a lifetime filled with music, fame, pressure, and survival, Chris Norman has reached the point where reflection becomes unavoidable. Because when you've lived that long, you stop chasing approval. You start chasing truth. And that's exactly why his words about Suzi Quatro carry such weight. For a man who spent decades on the stages under lights and inside a screaming crowds, Chris Norman's real story has always included something the music industry rarely allows: stability. While fame has destroyed countless artists through chaos, addiction, broken relationships, and endless reinvention, Chris Norman built something almost unthinkable in that world: a private life that actually lasted. In 1970, when a Smokie was only just beginning to gain momentum, he married his wife, Linda. That detail matters more than people realize, because this marriage didn't begin after success. It began before the world knew his name, before sold-out tours, before chart-topping hits, before the industry pressure became relentless. That meant their bond was built on shared youth, trust, and real life, not celebrity attention or public fantasy. And over the decades, in an industry notorious for broken marriages and short-lived commitments, that union endured for more than half a century. Linda remained a steady presence behind the scenes, offering emotional support and stability, while Chris navigated the demands of recording, touring, and staying relevant across changing musical eras. People close to them often describe their partnership as deeply private, rooted in respect rather than the spectacle. Together, Chris and Linda raised 5 children, and he consistently treated fatherhood as central to his identity, not something secondary to a career. Even during long periods away from home, he made conscious efforts to stay involved in their lives. For him, family was not a side story running quietly in the background. It was the anchor. And many observers believe that anchor is part of why he maintained his reputation as grounded and approachable, even when fame could have easily distorted everything. Then came another decision that said a lot about who he truly was. In 1986, the same year his solo career took off, and the world was watching him more closely than ever, the Norman family chose to relocate to the Isle of Man. Not London, not Los Angeles, not some celebrity capital designed for attention. The Isle of Man. The move wasn't just geographical, it was symbolic. The island offered privacy, tranquility, and distance from the intense spotlight of mainstream celebrity culture. It gave Chris Norman the ability to focus on music without sacrificing his family's peace. Its close-knit community and a slower pace suited his desire for normality. It meant his children could grow up without constant media pressure. And since relocating there, the Isle of Man remained his permanent home and creative refuge. From that quieter base, he continued to write, record, and tour internationally, proving something many artists never learn. You don't have to live inside the machine to succeed. Sometimes you survive by stepping away from it. And now, at 75, after decades of fame, triumph, sacrifice, and endurance, Chris Norman stands at the stage of life where reflection becomes natural. He has a long view of the music industry, a long memory of the people who shaped that era. And among all those figures, one name stands out with unmistakable clarity and respect: Suzi Quatro. Because for the first time in many years, Chris Norman finally spoke openly and at length about their connection, their shared era, and the admiration he has always held for her. At 75, Chris Norman doesn't speak like a man trying to impress anyone. He speaks like someone who has lived long enough to stop decorating the truth. When he looks back on the early 1970s, he remembers a music scene that felt raw, competitive, and electric with possibility. In his words, it was a time when everything felt new, when nobody really knew how far things could go, and when the rules weren't fully written yet. But then, Suzi Quatro arrived, and Chris Norman makes it clear. Her presence wasn't just noticeable, it was disruptive in the best way. When Suzi came along, he recalls she changed the picture. Not because she was marketed as different, not because she was allowed into a space, but because she didn't ask to fit into what already existed. She was her own thing completely. Chris emphasizes that Suzi Quatro's impact went far beyond her chart success. She was a female rock musician playing bass and fronting a hard-edged band in an industry dominated by men. Today, some people might underestimate what that meant back then, but Chris doesn't. He calls it bravery, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply walks into the room and refuses to back down. He points out something simple and sharp. In that era, it just wasn't done. And yet Suzi didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for permission, he says. She just did it. That honesty matters because it reveals what many male musicians quietly felt at the time. Chris admits that Suzi forced people, including him, to rethink assumptions they didn't even realize they carried. Because you couldn't dismiss her. Not with that attitude, not with that talent, not with that stamina. As their careers crossed through tours, TV appearances, and industry events, Chris remembers their encounters with warmth and respect. He doesn't describe her as distant or fake, he describes her as direct. She was always straight with people, he says. No nonsense, no pretending. What you saw was what you got. And then he adds something that cuts deeper than compliments. Suzi had a rare balance of toughness and humor. She could hold her own in any room, but she could also laugh at herself. Chris calls that combination powerful because it means a strength without ego, confidence without performance. But he doesn't romanticize what she went through either. He speaks about the pressures Suzi faced behind the scenes, pressures many fans never saw. She had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. Chris says that plainly, almost like a correction to history. He notes that while many artists were packaged and controlled during that era, Suzi fought to maintain her identity. She knew who she was, he says, and she wasn't going to let anyone rewrite that. And that leads to the question that matters most. Why now? Why speak so openly at 75? After so many years of silence, Chris pauses on that, and his answer is almost painfully simple. Age gives you honesty, he says. You stop worrying about how things will be taken. You stop performing the safe version of your truth. And you just want the record to be fair. For him, fairness means acknowledging Suzi Quatro's influence and resilience, not as a novelty, not as a female version of anything, but as what she truly was, a rock artist. And then Chris offers a final reflection that feels like closure, not just for him, but for an entire era. Time has softened rivalries and misunderstandings that once seemed important. Back then, everyone was fighting to survive and succeed, and sometimes that created distance or silence. Now, he says there is only respect. When I look back, he admits, I feel grateful to have shared that era with people like Suzi. She raised the bar for everyone. By the time Chris Norman reaches his closing thoughts, you can feel something different in his tone. This isn't the voice of a performer selling a story. It's the voice of a witness. A man who stood inside one of the most intense eras of modern music and lived long enough to see how history can blur, distort, or forget what truly mattered. And that is exactly why his final words about Suzi Quatro hit so hard. Because Chris doesn't just speak about her as a collaborator or a star from back then. He speaks about her as a marker of truth. He says that when younger artists ask him about that time, he always brings her name up. Not as trivia, not as a footnote, as a lesson. If younger artists ask me about that time, he says, I always mention her. And then he tells them exactly what to look at. Look at Suzi Quatro. Look at her courage. Not the kind of courage that's shouted on social media. Not the kind that's packaged into a brand. The kind of courage that walks into a male-dominated industry, picks up a bass, fronts a hard-edged band, and refuses to be treated like a novelty. The kind that holds its ground without asking the world for approval. Chris makes it clear that Suzi's legacy should not be framed as the female this or the first woman that. Those labels, even when meant as praise, can quietly shrink someone's place in history. And Chris refuses to let that happen. Suzi deserves her place in history, he insists, not as an exception, not as a gimmick, but as what she truly was, a rock artist. That's the core of everything he's saying. And when those words come from someone like Chris Norman, a man who lived through that era, toured that circuit, and saw how the industry treated people behind closed doors, they carry weight. At 75, his voice carries the clarity of hindsight. And in that clarity, he offers something rare, not gossip, not drama, but a heartfelt tribute that feels like justice, a way of saying, we saw you, we respected you, and history should never forget what you changed. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a legend can do near the end of a long journey is not to talk about themselves, but to use their platform to honor another pioneer who helped redefine what rock music could look and sound like. That is what Chris Norman finally did, and that is why this story matters. If you believe Suzi Quatro deserves her place in rock history, leave a comment below.